Do you have a favorite hiking snack you like to bring in the backcountry?
Usually something with chocolate.
You and I are very aligned on that. I'm a gold digger when it comes to trail mix. Like, there's no shame in it. I will be eating all the chocolate.
Reasonable. I remember just being really impacted by that and really developing a desire to protect places like Glacier Bay where that sort of thing wasn't happening.
Welcome to Who Runs This Park, a podcast where we uncover the untold stories of our national parks. Who Runs This Park is presented by Expert Voice. Gear up for adventure with Expert Voice, the outdoor gear source for industry experts. Outdoor brands like Big Agnes, Mammoth, La Sportiva, Chaco, and more offer discounts on Expert Voice of up to 60% off for industry experts like you. And you can join Expert Voice for free today and see what brands you qualify for. So, whatever the next adventure calls for, make sure you're prepared with expertvoice.com/parks and gear up for adventure. If you like chocolate, which may be a red flag if you don't, you have to try out Ritual Chocolate. Ritual Chocolate is my favorite chocolate brand by far, and I learned about them from spending a lot of time in Park City, Utah, where they're based nearby, and actually got to take my family to a chocolate tasting at their factory. And it totally changed the way we all think about and eat small batch chocolate. While I already loved the bars, it opened up my world to the variety and depth of flavor profiles chocolate can have. I'm excited to be sharing this with you all. Who Runs This Park listeners get 10% off their online purchases of Ritual Chocolate. Go to ritualchocolate.com, that's RITUAL chocolate.com, and use promo code WRTP for 10% off. You'll be thanking me later, I promise. And did I mention that I'm obsessed with their packaging? It's so beautiful, so even just having the bars and opening them is a treat. Get on it and order some chocolate. Today we have Lena Pace with us, Arches and Canyonlands National Park Superintendent. She is additionally Superintendent of Hovenweep and Natural Bridges National Monuments. Arches and Canyonlands National Parks are both located in eastern Utah and are each famous on their own accord. Arches is home to the Delicate Arch, which has become the symbol of Utah. It's even on their license plate and is one of the most recognized natural formations in the U.S. Canyonlands is a much larger park with many extreme sports recreational opportunities. Lena is relatively new to this most recent position, having been superintendent since early April, so we are lucky to get insight into her transition and her hopes and plans for managing the national park sites. Additionally, Lena is a second-generation National Park Service employee, growing up preliminarily outside of Glacier Bay National Park and Preserve up in Alaska, and has spent the majority of her career in the Park Service and law enforcement. We're beyond excited for this unique perspective her experiences will bring to our conversation. Welcome to Who Runs This Park. It's a joy to have you here today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. I know you are probably still in the transitionary period with Arches and Canyonlands, so I'd love to out that transition and maybe some of the experiences you've had already. I'm sure you've done a lot already, but just as you've accustomed to this new role?
Sure. So I was selected for a detail, just a temporary position back in December, and I arrived here in the park as the acting superintendent in January. So I got to spend a few months in the parks and in the communities in the quietest part of the year, which was really unique and kind of a neat time to come to the parks. I had an opportunity to get out and hike around the parks and see what they were like during the less visited months, which I really enjoyed. I was selected for the position and ultimately permanently started the job just April 21st. Which I realize is only about 6 weeks ago. It seems like it's been longer.
Oh, wow.
So
when you put weeks to it, you're like, oh, that's not like, because it's June now. So you're like, oh, April was a little while ago. But if you put actual weeks to it, you're like, oh, 6 weeks is like nothing.
It's not that much, but because I had kind of a nice ramp up, right? Because I had an opportunity to act first. Yeah. And so I had an opportunity to get to know the parks and the people, which has really helped as I've started the permanent position, kind of get me up to speed and hit the ground running. So far, I've been spending a lot of time just getting to know the parks and the people, right? Getting out into the parks, getting out with each of the divisions to see what work they do and how they do it, and talk to employees and learn about them and what they do. Making initial introductions with our partners and the local communities. So I'm doing a lot of kind of meeting and greeting, but all with really good value coming out of those conversations. So I'm really enjoying getting up to speed. I might not know the answer to every question that you asked today, but I'm learning a lot and I have some good notes with me. So hopefully I'll be able to give you some good info.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm excited I think it's, as I've talked to different superintendents, there's a huge range of just how the tenure of the superintendents. And I've talked to a few who, had more recently started the role versus some who have been the superintendent of that park for 10 plus years. And I think it's exciting to me to hear your journey and kind of get that insider story of like what it's like to acclimate as a superintendent and what that process of learning about the parks and the partners and all of that is like. So I'm excited to hear that perspective and get a sneak peek into that. What are some of the different experiences you've had in the park? What hikes have you gone on within Arches and Canyonlands as you've been exploring and learning?
Sure. Well, I mentioned I got here in January, and I think some of my favorite hikes were those first couple of weeks I was here when most people out in the parks didn't know me yet. So I got to kind of be a visitor in the parks and go out and experience them when I hadn't yet met everybody and they didn't recognize me. So I went up to Island in the Sky. It was my first time to Island in the Sky. I'd been to other parts of Canyonlands, but never iSky before. And I did a day of hiking. I did kind of all of the overlooks, took all my photos, took my selfies for my parents back home, that sort of thing. I hiked I hiked the White Rim Overlook Trail. I decided to do, Grand View is one of the most popular trails in Island in the Sky. And the White Rim Overlook is a little bit less popular, a little bit off the beaten track. And I decided to do that one. And it's a lovely, mostly flat trail that's not quite as stunning along the way as the Grand View Overlook. But when you get to the end, it's a very similar view where you're looking out over the White Rim Trail and out towards the Needles District. It was a really, really beautiful hike. And there was nobody else on the trail. There was nobody else out at the end. And I got to just sit there and be there. And I took a few photos and I sat and had a snack and just kind of experienced the park. And that was I think that was maybe my first weekend here. And that was just a lovely day and a really great experience. I did get out into Arches. I did which one did I do the first day? I did the Wall Street, the hike down Wall Street. It's big, tall buildings on either side, but they're canyons. It makes you feel like you're walking down, the street in New York City, but there's these big canyon walls on either side of you. And it's just a really neat, very accessible hike that I did, just a short hike. And then my mom visited the first couple weeks I was here as well. And I took her on all the hikes. We went and saw the sunrise at Mesa Arch up an Island in the Sky. And we went and did Grand View and we hiked Delicate Arch and saw the windows and kind of did all of those visits. And that was really fun to share the park with a family member as well early on in my experience. So that's kind of what I've done in my personal time. As superintendent, at work, I've had an opportunity to get out into the backcountry a little bit more. So I spent a day with one of our backcountry rangers out in the backcountry of Arches. We drove in one of the back ways and got to see the backcountry and hike a couple of trails and see the 4-wheel drive trail that people come in and drive. That was pretty cool. I got to spend 3 or 4 days out in the maze with the district ranger out there, which was really, really fascinating. We drove all over the place, hiked through both the Red Cliffs and the Maze District of Canyonlands. The Orange Cliffs are part of Glen Canyon National Recreation Area. And we have a duty station. We have a ranger station that's actually in Glen Canyon, technically, because that's the best place to have a duty station. But those folks take care of the Maze District from the western side of the park over there. And so we got to explore all of those areas and do some really great hiking out there as well. It's been a neat experience to get out with some of these employees who just know the resource and know the park so well and have great history and information to share. And also see what they do, right? See what their day is like and what the work is like that they're doing. So that's been really fun.
My brain is moving in a million directions. I'm like, okay, here are all the different kind of tidbits. One call out, it's really cool that you got to do some backcountry experience and like you said, spend some time with park rangers. And a project I'm working on in tandem with these superintendent interviews. My first one is like almost in the works. It's with North Cascades and it's actually going on backcountry experiences with park rangers with the idea of showcasing stories like in the field as well. And so it's kind of there's the high level approach from the superintendent's bird's eye view and then digging deeper into specific roles with different park rangers. And the whole idea of this like pitch that I've worked with Dawn, the North Cascade superintendent, is that by spending time with someone in the backcountry, you get deeper stories and you're just like sharing, you're like working together as a team and like you go from like being strangers to like being teammates. And so my hope is that through that type of experience, it'll be a really good way to get stories of the park rangers and just like really highlight, I think, like the whole overarching thesis of this podcast and all of these things is to like highlight all the work that goes into managing and maintaining our national parks. And I feel like pretty passionate that it hasn't been told at a larger scale. I think the stories are definitely told, but just not highlighted at like a national scale for like anyone who just likes going to our national parks. It's like pretty unlikely that they'll also know or be interested in like how the parks are run and maintained. And so that was cool for me to hear. The other thing that I found interesting when I was preparing, so I've been to Arches before, pretty briefly. We essentially stopped, my dad and I stopped on a road trip. We were driving from Texas to Utah to like Park City area. And you literally drive right through Moab. And so I like convinced him, I was like, I will go on this road trip, like, instead of me flying and meeting you there, I will go on this road trip with you if we can stop in Arches. And so we spent like a morning hiking around and stuff like that. But I had never have never been to Canyonlands. And so I was shocked when I was researching it of like, one, the concept of districts I had never really heard of in the Park Service. And then, so I'm curious to hear a little bit more about those from your perspective. And then like specifically, I was researching that the Maze is one of the most remote and challenging backcountry places in the US. So that was crazy. The off-roading was unique. Like there's so much to Canyonlands that I was like, literally none of this I've seen in a lot of the parks that I've been researching and interviewing and stuff like that. So yeah, I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about the districts and just, I think, some of these things that make Canyonlands unique.
Sure, yeah. So the district setup is not unique to Canyonlands. There's several parks around the country who have districts. And sometimes a district is more operational or programmatic, where there might be a backcountry district and a front country district, where it's more about what programs you're doing or what type of work you're doing. In our parks, those districts are geographic. We do have backcountry rangers in each district, for example, but they work with the local districts to do the work and to organize the work. So Canyonlands has technically 3 districts. And I know in your question that you sent ahead, you had mentioned 4 districts. The 4th district that's not officially a district, but we really treat it like one, is the river. And so we have Island in the Sky, which is the most accessible from Moab, the most accessible from the highway. And so that's probably the most visited just because it's an easy day trip. Island in the Sky is just what you might expect. It's this tall mesa top in the sky with views just in 360 degrees, where you can see several different mountain ranges that are snow-capped. You can see all the way down to Bears Ears National Monument. You can see the river and the confluence of the Green and the Colorado rivers. It's really just a gorgeous spot. So Island in the Sky is a little bit more visited. It's a very, very commonly visited. I mentioned that we went and saw the sunrise at Mesa Arch. That's another very iconic photo that you see from people is the pictures of that sunrise. It's really cool opportunity to go and see that if you have the chance. The Needles district is the next closest to Moab. And I talk about distance to Moab just because Moab tends to be the jumping off point for a lot of our visitors, right? So a lot of our folks stay here overnight and then go out into the parks as day trips. Needles, that does have campgrounds, so sometimes people camp down there as well or do backcountry trips from the Needles. There are some neat backcountry trails you can do. The Needles is named for these really unique rock structures that you see when you're down there that kind of hard to describe, but if you Google the images, they're really these beautiful, tall, needle-like rock structures that you see. So a little bit more remote, slightly less visited, but also a very popular place to go. You drive, it's actually a beautiful drive from Moab down into the Needles. You drive across BLM land. There's a really famous archaeological panel called the Newspaper Rock that you can see on your way down there. There's kind of some neat things to do along the way. And then folks who go to the Needles, many of them do hiking. That's a very common activity. A lot of our visitors across all of the parks, that's one of their primary activities. There's campgrounds and picnic areas, and there are some four-wheel drive trails down there as well. Back to Island in the Sky, too, I mentioned that I did the hike, the White Rim Overlook. One of the most popular trails / roads in Canyonlands is the White Rim Trail. And from above in Island in the Sky, you can see from many places the White Rim Trail that goes along the rim. It's just above the Colorado River. People run it, people bike it, people four-wheel drive it, all of the above. We actually got a couple of e-bikes for our rangers to go out there and patrol it on e-bikes just in the last year. Our partner, the Canyonlands Natural History Association, purchased us a couple of e-bikes to allow the rangers to get out in the backcountry a little bit more easily and carry more gear with them. So that's a pretty cool opportunity that the rangers have to do that. And then you have the Maze District. And like I mentioned, the Maze District is actually based out of Glen Canyon National Recreation Area. So Glen Canyon borders us on our south, but also borders us on our west. They have this Orange Cliffs area on the west side of Canyonlands that's part of the recreation area. And that's where we have a small ranger station. There's a small campground out there. Most of our visitors to the Maze and the Orange Cliffs do both. People don't generally visit just the Maze or just the Orange Cliffs just because of the geography up there. They're generally visiting both areas. And so we work collaboratively with Glen Canyon to manage that area, which is somewhat unique. So from the Orange Cliffs, it's mostly overnight trips. We have very few day trips because it takes a long time to get out there. And most of the traveling that you'll do either will be four-wheel drive vehicle on very rough, technical four-wheel drive roads, or hiking, or in some cases, mountain biking. There are some folks who go out there and bike as well. And so they're generally multi-day trips. We have designated campsites or some of our backpackers will hike out in the backcountry away from the roads as well. And then down in the maze is probably famous from Edward Abbey's writing. He writes a lot about going out into the maze in his time as a ranger here at Arches. The maze is named for these maze-like rock structures. You can walk along these wash beds, and there's these kind of a maze of canyons that you can almost get lost in. Hopefully not actually get lost, but it's really a neat experience. And then I mentioned the river, and I should say rivers. We have the Green River that is the largest contributor to the Colorado River, and the confluence of those rivers is in Canyonlands. And so we have what we call the River Shop, which is almost like a district, although they're kind of in between several different districts because they kind of go along Island in the Sky. They also go right along the Maze District, and they take out a lot of their trips in Glen Canyon National Recreation Area. So they're kind of all of the above. They also go along the Needles. So they experience a little bit of each of the areas, but the rivers are highly visited, a lot of them through guides and outfitters. People can rent canoes and kayaks, or they can go on a raft with a guide and do multi-day trips. Cataract Canyon, which is kind of the southern end of Canyonlands on the river, is world-class, class 5 rapids. Only people who really have the skills can go and do that section of river. So a lot of folks do it with our permit holders, our concessions that go down and do guided trips. But our rangers are also expert boat operators. And so they're up and down the river regularly doing search and rescue, doing permit checks. They do a lot of maintenance of campsites and removal of invasive species and all sorts of things like that along the river. So it's really, Canyonlands is really a unique and diverse place. If that's not clear from everything that I just said.
Sounds like it. Oh my gosh.
Everywhere you are has a different feel, a different energy, a different types of rocks, different even, mini climates. It's really an interesting place to be.
I mean, even the diversity and the specializations the park rangers have in Canyonlands is unique. And again, this is why I love having these conversations, because I was talking to the superintendent of Kobuk Valley up in Alaska and talking about like park ranger pilots, for like bush pilots, and then also like being able to drive boats and snowmobiles. And so just like and then like you're saying, like to be able to navigate the class 5 rapids in Canyonlands, that's no small feat by any means. I mean, I think I've done like class 3 and I'm like, I'm decently content with doing no more than class 4, maybe.
Right.
So that's cool. One question I do have is regarding the off-roading. And again, this is partially just following my curiosities because I haven't heard of this really before. Do people do multi-day trips off-roading? And you like camp or car camp?
They absolutely do. And I do want to just clarify, we don't allow off-roading because we make you drive on roads, right? So we want people to stay on the designated roads and routes, but some of those roads and routes are designated as 4-wheel drive routes where it really does require a level of technical skill and expertise, and also a vehicle with 4-wheel drive and clearance. We have folks show up sometimes in like an all-wheel drive Subaru or something like that doesn't have the clearance or the actual 4-wheel drive, right? So we spend a lot of time with education in those areas to make sure that folks have both the vehicle and the skill to be able to do that. But people absolutely camp that way. It's car camping, but on a different scale, right? Everything you need to have is in your vehicle. Unique. You can't hook up to your electricity, or there's no toilet nearby. You have to bring wag bags or toilet facilities with you and then carry everything back out with you. So it's really a unique way to travel. Other than our front country, more developed areas, we generally, except for a couple of highly visited areas, so like the White Rim Trail, we do have vault toilets in those designated campsites. But in many of our areas where people are camping, we expect a carry in, carry out of everything, of all of your waste. So that's a little bit unique in Canyonlands. We get so little rain, so little water, and the soil is such that digging holes and leaving waste behind is not something that's acceptable in the desert. It'll stay that way for a long time. It won't become part of the environment like it might in some other parks where we might allow digging a foxhole, if you will, for your waste. So it's a little bit different in the backcountry. But yeah, car camping, Jeep camping, Bronco camping, whatever it is that you happen to be driving is very popular here. And it's unique in the sense that in a lot of parks, we don't allow that we don't have that type of access. We don't have those types of roads. But as long as you stay on those designated routes, you're able to get into some really incredible places in a way that you wouldn't otherwise. It would take too long for most people to have to hike or get out into those areas otherwise. So it allows people to get really deep into the backcountry. And like you mentioned with the maze, once you get out into the maze itself, once you're in Canyonlands on that side of the park, there are some areas you can drive in. But once you hike down into the maze itself, there aren't any designated routes for driving. And so that all is foot traffic out in the maze itself. And it's really a unique opportunity to be alone, to see a dark sky with no lights anywhere nearby, to experience true silence and solitude in a way that in a lot of parks, it's hard to find that because you're still pretty close to civilization. So the maze really is unique in that way.
Yeah, that's cool. And it kept both Canyonlands and Arches are pretty well known for their dark skies,
Yes.
it seems. I think partially it seems like the altitude has something to do with it. And yeah, just like also something about the Utah skies are also just very clear, like even up in Park City where it's a little bit more populated. That's cool. That's a unique, I mean, talking about Jeep camping or like you said, Bronco camping, the ability to get farther in the backcountry than you were saying, because there's not much water. And so like you're limited backpacking by like how much water you can carry essentially. And so it sounds like it expands your ability. Obviously you can put a lot more water in your car. So that's super unique.
Absolutely. And I'll point out too, because you mentioned dark skies, Natural Bridges was actually the first dark sky park in the National Park Service. And both Natural Bridges and Hove and Weep have official dark sky recognition. And actually the city of Moab, just last week, it was announced that the city of Moab also has international dark sky recognition. So it's kind of cool to be in this area. That's part of, we are able to support each other in that way, both between the parks and also now with our local community, in terms of sharing this dark sky and enhancing each other's dark skies. So it's really a cool area to be in. Having come from the East Coast and the DC area, you're lucky if you can see stars most nights just because there's so much human lighting in the area. So I've really enjoyed getting to see the stars again.
Yeah, I used to live in New York City and I had a couple friends that lived like north of Central Park, right on the cusp of Harlem. And we would be on their rooftops sometimes and it was like, if you saw like 5 stars, it was a big deal. You're like, it's like 5 stars. And then you also at the same time see like 15 planes.
Right.
But you're still like, even that, you're like, oh my gosh, like, look at the stars. This is crazy.
Yeah.
So I can empathize with that of just the beauty. I'm sure that you can see every night around Moab is probably pretty inspiring.
Cool.
You had mentioned that you've met a lot of the different partners and stuff like that most recently and done some intros and kind of starting to continue those relationships from the previous superintendent. Can you share about some of the partners that you've met with and maybe some hopes or collaborations you have planned or hope to do?
Sure. So our 2 kind of key partners are the CNHA, which I mentioned, the Canyonlands Natural History Association, and they run all of the stores in each of the parks. So the little visitor center stores, they do a ton of business.
Cool.
They get a lot of folks who come through those stores and are able to buy things that say Arches National Park on them and that sort of thing. They also sell guidebooks and safety equipment for hiking and water bottles and that sort of thing. They're a really great partner. The funds that they bring in from that activity, from selling different items in our stores, come back into the park largely to support educational activities and interpretive activities primarily. And they fund a lot of really cool projects with the park and actually pay for some employees to be out and educating visitors as well. So they're a really great partner. Our other key partner is our philanthropic partner, which is Friends of Arches and Canyonlands. And again, the Friends group is right here in Moab, as is CNHA, and also just a great partner. They raise money to fund different projects. They recently funded a search and rescue truck that's a big, nice 4-wheel drive truck that has a lot of storage on it. We can bring all of our search and rescue gear out to a site where we're able to provide good search and rescue response to people at different areas of the parks, which is really, really helpful. So that's an example of some of the great work that they do. Both of those partners I meet with regularly. I'm just getting to know them and they're just getting to know me. Transitioning some of the temporary folks who were points of contact for those over to my office, and I'm starting to have regular meetings with them and really enjoying getting to know them and the work that they do. Just like our Park Service employees, they're very passionate about the mission and protecting these areas and educating the public about them. So it's been really fun to get to know them. More broadly, obviously, we have our community partners, not only here in Moab, but Blanding and Monticello, which are south of here and closer down to both the southern ends of the park, but also closer to Hove and Weep and Natural Bridges, getting to know those folks a little bit better. Still kind of wading into those waters, still getting to know who's who and making those connections, but enjoying that as well. And then obviously we have our tribal partners. We have, I think, 29 across the 4 parks. We have 29 associated tribes who have history in these parks. And so again, when you talk about the uniqueness and the vastness of these parks, A lot of different tribes came to these areas for different reasons. A lot of different tribes came down to the river corridor in particular. It's really, really interesting to get to know some of our local tribal partners as well. I actually just spent last week 4 days, 3 nights out on the river with several of our tribal partners. We had an opportunity to...
Oh, yeah. We had talked about that over email.
It was really, because I was on the river last week, we couldn't do this interview last week. We had to move it. And I appreciate that because it was really an amazing experience.
Yeah, of course.
Not only for me to get out on the river and, like I mentioned, seeing what the river rangers are doing and, being with them as they're talking to visitors and checking on campsites and things like that. But we also had an opportunity to visit several really amazing archaeological sites, some panels and pictographs and petroglyphs. We got to see some structures that are still standing that the Park Service has done some limited maintenance on to make sure that they're still standing. We saw some really amazing wildlife. We saw a baby bighorn sheep that got startled when we boated by and ran along the shore, and that was really cool. I've never seen just a little furry baby one.
I'm assuming it doesn't have horns.
It did not have horns, and it almost looked like a baby horse in shape. It had like the long, gangly legs and hadn't quite grown into himself yet. So he was kind of, it was really cute. Unique opportunity to see that. Lots of blue herons and other water birds and things like that. It was really the river corridor. The first night we stayed out there, there were several big trees around, and several of us were awake half the night because there were all these birds singing to each other. It almost sounded like a jungle. Really a different experience than you have when you're up on the mesa or up on the plateau away from the water. So that was a really great experience to both get to know our tribal partners and also hear the stories that they were sharing about these areas and their connection to the area and how their ancestors experienced the area. So the tribal partners are really, not only are we required by law to consult and work with and engage with our tribal partners, but that's, in my opinion, just one of the most important things that we're doing as being stewards of these land and of that history. Hopefully, we're going to do several more trips like that with various tribes to make sure that they all have a chance to see the river and see these places, especially as we're engaging in a comprehensive river management plan over the next couple of years.
I had a question, but I got engrossed by the story and I was just thinking about all the river experiences. That's really cool. What is the point of the trips like that? Like you said, is it kind of to get to know each tribal partner and have a area for people to talk about maybe what's on their mind? And then also you said to be able to experience the river. Are most tribal partners maybe, I guess, where are they located? Are they nearby or...
Yeah, so it's a little bit of all of that, right? As a new superintendent, it's a great opportunity for me and them to get to know each other, talk. And like you mentioned, going out in the backcountry with the ranger, going out in the backcountry with anybody is a great way to get to know them and have good conversations in that place and about that place, right? Some of the conversations we had were about where campsites are located, whether that's appropriate in their proximity to cultural sites and things like that. So we were able to have some really meaningful conversations related to the place that we were in. It was also an opportunity for them to see the river. Some of them had been down parts of the river. Some of them had not been down those rivers at all before. And so for them to reconnect to that area is really important as well. But I mentioned the Comprehensive River Management Plan, or the CRMP, that we're engaging in. The last river management plan was last done in the 80s. And so in the 80s, we didn't have pack rafting. We didn't have e-bikes. We didn't have people hiking through the Needles and pack rafting across the Colorado and going into the maze for multiple days, right? Like Jeeps couldn't go where they can now. And so it's a really different environment in terms of the river corridor and the types of activities people are doing and want to do. And so we're updating that river management plan. And as part of that, we're really looking at what our desired conditions are for each of those sections of the river. What do we want these rivers to feel like and look like and be? How do we want them to be protected? For these cultural sites along the river corridor, how do we want to protect them and make sure that they're appropriately both protected and preserved, but also interpreted where appropriate? How are we telling those stories on behalf of our partners? And so part of this also is, as we engage in that process, we want them engaged in the planning. And for them to be engaged in the planning, we want them to see what it looks like now and how we're managing it now. And so it was an opportunity to share that with them and hear feedback from them, also in furtherance of that planning opportunity. And we will be continuing to engage with all of those tribes moving forward. Are they close or are they far? The answer is yes. We have some that are right here local and some that are quite a ways away. There were many tribes that traveled here for different reasons or traveled through this area. They weren't all necessarily just based here. And so there's folks kind of spread across the Colorado Plateau that have a connection to the parks here.
You had mentioned archaeological panels, and I actually don't know what that means. Is that or I don't know what that term means.
So a panel is generally a piece of rock that has some sort of markings on it. And we've traditionally used the term rock art. We're not using the term art anymore because art implies that we know the purpose of those markings, that we know that the purpose was for art, right? Which is kind of a Western modern construction where we say, there's these drawings, so they must have been for people to look at and enjoy, like we enjoy art. Whereas in fact, much of it was writing, some of it was mapping, some of it was history, writing down history. And so now we're using terms like rock markings or rock writing. And so a panel is just, a usually flat rock surface where there is some sort of rock markings, former indigenous peoples in the area.
I have a fun question.
Sure.
And then like a silly question that I like to ask. These are all fun questions, but it's more of a silly question I like to ask superintendents. And then we'll go back in time a little bit to hear a little more kind of about your just experience growing up. But you've gotten to go on a lot of backcountry trips recently, and it sounds like you enjoy hiking and all of those outdoor things. Do you have a favorite hiking snack you like to bring in the backcountry?
Usually something with chocolate.
You and I are very aligned on that.
I'm all about like the trail mix or whatever, but it has to have like the M&Ms in it. I really enjoy something sweet when I'm out hiking. I like the sweet salty combination usually of some sort of like gorp or trail mix. I actually have a memory of one of my favorite hiking memories from childhood is that my mother and my sister and my grandmother and my sister was 8 and I was 13, and we hiked the Chilkoot Trail. We hiked the Canadian portion of the Chilkoot Trail, which is at Klondike Gold Rush National Historical Park up in Alaska. And apparently my sister and I were not, I don't remember this, but my sister and I were not particularly excited about the hiking part. There was like a long distance hiking, right? And this was kind of an experiment with heavy backpacks and everything. And my mom said that she was bribing us with M&Ms the whole way down the trail, that, if we get to the next mile marker, we get to this thing, you can have some M&Ms. And so apparently that worked real well, and we got into it, and then we really enjoyed the hike. So I think that's where my sweet treats enjoyment comes from when I'm hiking.
No, I was in Rocky Mountain National Park a few weeks ago just for a day hike, and literally brought trail mix, and you made me I literally was sitting on the trail just picking out the M&Ms from the bag.
And at the end you just had this bag of nuts.
Yes, I was telling the two people I was with, I'm like, I'm sorry, like I'm a gold digger when it comes to trail mix. Like there's no shame in it. I will be eating all the chocolate.
Reasonable.
So my apologies. That's a great segue, actually, to I had mentioned in the intro that you are a second-generation National Park Service employee, which is awesome. There's been a few that I've interviewed, so that's been really fun to hear about. But I'd love to learn a little bit more about your experience growing up and what your parents did in the Park Service.
Sure. So I grew up in a small town called Gustavus, which was what we call a gateway community to Glacier Bay National Park and Preserve. And Gustavus it's a very small community. It has about 400 to 450 people who live there year round, and that population grows a little bit in the summer because of tourism. But it's a very small town in terms of people who stay there all year round. It's very small. I went to school in a one building schoolhouse, K through 12. There were 6 people in my class, and that was one of the bigger ones. Some of the classes only graduate with 1 or 2. And the interesting thing about Gustavus,
1 or 2 people?
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, it's a very, so grades are combined. So, there's like kindergarten, first grade is together, usually, or first and second. It kind of depends on the size of the classes. 3rd, 4th, and 5th was together. So there was basically junior high was all in one class together, and high school was all in one class together. And sometimes you'd get different assignments based on your grades. So it was a really, on one hand, it was a really cool way to grow up. On the other hand, gosh, if you're not friends with the other girl who's in your grade, then you don't have anywhere else to go, right? So being in a small town like that had challenges and opportunities. I grew up in a house my parents built. It was an actual round house. They built it completely round. It's right in the center of town. I had a horse growing up, and I used to ride him to school sometimes. And I grew up without electricity or running water. We had kerosene lamps until I was about 10. And then we got, until I was 7. We got electricity when I was 7. And then we got indoor plumbing, full indoor flushing plumbing when I was 12. So a lot of kids that grew up that way, in that area grew up that way as well that I grew up with. It was a really unique way to grow up. Some of my earliest memories are from Glacier Bay National Park and Preserve. Gustavus is surrounded on 3 sides by the park. It's like a little exclusion from the park boundary. And then on the 4th side is water. So basically you're in this little bubble surrounded by National Park. And so the National Park was my backyard. And I mentioned We call Gustavus a gateway community. Moab is also a gateway community. That's the term that we use for these communities that we visit and stay in and then, leap off of to go out and visit these parks. And so there's really an interesting connection between my hometown and a town like Moab, coming back here, and these people who grew up and have all these memories in these parks that are their backyards, and have a real connection to them. I had that same experience and energy growing up in Gustavus. But I think one of my very earliest memories is of sailing in Glacier Bay with my parents. We would go on, multi-day or sometimes even multi-week sailing trips. And we had this sailing boat that had a little front bow. It had a flat bow, which is unique. And it had a little front nook where you would put like the anchor and the anchor line. And I remember them like curling me up with some blankets in that nook. And there was a skylight I could look at. And I remember being like curled up with the anchor line and looking up this skylight as I was probably 3. So I really gained gained is not the right word. I grew up with a connection to that place and to that land and to that experience. I mentioned that experience of solitude in a place like Glacier Bay or really any of the parks in Alaska. Not only the solitude, but the scale of what you're part of when you're out there really is humbling and awe-inspiring. I mean, it's hard to describe unless you've been in that situation. That was what we did on weekends and summer holidays and things like that, was that we got out into the park, and sometimes not the park, sometimes Forest Service land nearby or whatever, but a lot of public land in that area that we experienced growing up. One of the things that struck me early in life, at the time there was no ferry service. We flew back and forth to Juneau. That was really the only way to go, and Juneau was the big city, even though there were only about 40,000 people who lived there, so still a smaller town. Flying from Gustavus to Juneau, especially back then, you could really see the impacts of clear-cut logging in the Tongass forest and sometimes off the Tongass. And I remember that being really impactful to me, flying over and looking down and seeing just, the word scar doesn't even cover it, right? Just these whole mountainsides that were clear-cut logged. Today, you fly over and there is starting to be some reforestation, but it's not like a traditional forest in that all the trees are the same age, right? So that's different than the way a forest normally grows, where trees are of different ages and you have those different levels and things like that. So I remember just being really impacted by that and really developing a desire to protect places like Glacier Bay where that sort of thing wasn't happening. My parents both worked many jobs over the time, very small town. You kind of work whatever jobs are available to you. My dad worked for Alaska Airlines for a time. My mom was a school teacher for quite a while and a librarian for a while. But my mom was a seasonal interpretive ranger. So she did the interpretive talks and nature walks and that sort of thing. And my dad was a boat operator for most of his career and a supervisory boat operator towards the end. One of the interesting and unique things that happens in Glacier Bay is there's most of the visitation in Glacier Bay is from cruise ships, but we don't have a cruise ship dock.
Really?
We don't have facilities on land for those cruise ships to stop at. So unlike, Klondike Gold Rush and Skagway, the cruise ships pull up, people get off and they go out into the developed area of Skagway. In Glacier Bay, they stay on board the cruise ship the whole time. So all summer long for 3 or 4 months a year, there are 1 or 2 cruise ships almost every day of the summer, starting in April and going into October. And the Park Service basically brings the visitor center to the tourists. So rather than having the tourists come off and onto land, the Park Service goes out and boards the cruise ships, and they sell, the NHA comes along, the Natural History Association, and they sell books and things like that, just like you would in the visitor center. And the interpretive rangers rove around the cruise ships and answer questions, and they'll do a slide program in the theater during the day, and they'll talk on the loudspeaker and point out wildlife and things like that when they're at key locations. And so that's what my mom did for many years as she worked for interpretation. And my dad would drive the boat that went up, and the cruise ship slows down to about 10 knots. It doesn't stop. And the little boat comes alongside, and they're going along because that allows the little boat to kind of be sucked along the side. And they drop a rope ladder, and you climb up the rope ladder into the cruise ship, and you spend the day in the cruise ship. So my first season with the National Park Service, that's what I did. My dad would drive the boat, and my mom and I were in interpretation. And we would go climb these little rope ladders and spend days on cruise ships. Suffice it to say, I had a great time. The all-inclusive buffets that were on the cruise ships were not great for my waistline that summer. But it was really an interesting way to talk to tourists or visitors and see the park in a different way. What I did learn from that summer was that interpretation was not the division I wanted to stay in. So that kind of launched me into looking elsewhere in the Park Service for other things that I wanted to do. But in terms of growing up, that was my entry into the Park Service. But backing up a little bit, I used to go to work with my dad when I was pretty young. Like I said, he was a boat operator, and this was before the government was too concerned with liability and that sort of thing. And he would take me on board the boat, and I'd go with him, and I got to know all the interpretive rangers and things like that. And I have very fond memories of that. One of my favorite photos of my dad and I was probably 10 or 12, and he's in uniform and I'm not, and we're walking holding hands up the dock in Glacier Bay. And that's, one of my fondest memories. I always say that was my entry into the Park Service. So it was a really unique way to grow up, and it really instilled in me a deep sense of wanting to protect these special places and wanting to be in these special places, right? Wanting to be able to be out in wilderness and wildness in that way.
So with the clear logging, when you're talking about that, it made me think of when I talked to the superintendent of Lake Clark National Park and Preserve, so Suzanne Fleet Green. She grew up in Alaska, and when she was growing up, it was about really heated debates on kind of resourcing in Alaska, and that really kind of kickstarted her career. She worked in DC for a while for different like environmental agencies and stuff like that. It led her to be very passionate about protecting land. And I think it's cool to hear your experience with that also, of especially Alaska, which people, it still is so rugged, but you can kind of see the impacts versus like I grew up in Austin, and like you're not as exposed to, there are already houses and buildings everywhere. It's not like you're seeing like, oh my gosh, like look at how much this environment is changing by this industry or whatnot. It's just kind of, it is what it is. And you live in the suburbs and whatever. And so, yeah, that's really cool. What is clear cut logging, or is it just?
So clear cut logging, I guess the best word is indiscriminate. It's cutting everything down, right? You're just going through and cutting everything down and taking the wood that's usable for different purposes. A lot of logging that's practiced more modernly, it's not across the board, but as we start to learn more about logging and about sustainable use of those resources, it's more selective, where you go and you just select certain types of trees. There's trees of certain sizes and you leave other ones to grow and things like that, where the environment is allowed to kind of rehabilitate itself in a different way. And so clear-cut logging for a long time was the way people made money off the resource. That was the way some of the tribal organizations up in Alaska in particular, but also the Forest Service, practiced clear-cut logging as a efficient way to make money, right? But one of the interesting things that you see when you go back to that same part of Southeast Alaska now is that ecotourism has taken over. We understand now that there's also money to be made. There's also a living to be made by sharing these special places and protecting these special places. And so we've seen that shift just in my lifetime, which has been really fascinating. I actually just yesterday, there was a delegation of park rangers and park managers from Mongolia who came and visited Arches yesterday. I got to go out and spend a few hours with them. And one of the interesting things they're dealing with is that very problem is right now they're making money from using and selling the resources. And they're really hoping, these park service folks from Mongolia are really hoping to shift that into how do we make that economically viable by sharing the resources and protecting it, but not using it, not depleting it. And so we had some really interesting conversations through interpreters yesterday about that very thing. But we are seeing more of that benefit to the local communities from protecting these places instead, which is really heartening to see.
For the folks coming from Mongolia, was there a specific reason they came to Arches? Like, is the landscape similar, or was it just the relationships y'all had?
I think it was some relationships. They had been on some BLM land recently, and they were kind of touring around this region, looking at several different parks, and this was one of the ones on their stop. So they weren't here just for Arches, but Arches they had come along the river corridor and looked at some of the BLM land that's along the Colorado River, just northeast of Moab. And then we brought them down into the park for a few hours to talk to them as well about what we do in the Park Service versus the BLM. It was kind of a neat opportunity for them to see both agencies and what we do.
You did spend a good chunk of your career, as I mentioned, as a law enforcement officer. So I'd love to hear, you had said, and my parents always said this when I was growing up, of doing different jobs or internships, like it's good to learn what you don't like. And so it sounds like you got that experience as an interpretive ranger, but then were able to pivot to law enforcement.
Yeah. So, I distinctly remember, I won't say I hated it. I didn't not enjoy it. I have a lot of respect for the people who do that work. I just realized that wasn't what I wanted to do forever, right? That was not my ball of wax. And so one of the things that Glacier Bay, I'm not sure if they still do it, but at the time they did a lot of air quality monitoring, and the law enforcement rangers in Glacier Bay would do the air quality monitoring. And they had these smaller, fast boats. And one of the things that they would do is they would pace the cruise ship basically, and they'd get up and measure the air quality downwind of the cruise ship to see how the cruise ship stack emissions were impacting air quality in Glacier Bay. And so I remember being on the cruise ship and looking out at the rangers in this tiny fast boat and thinking, that looks fun. What they're doing looks neat. Around the same time as I started working seasonally for the Park Service, I initially, like I said, I was interpretive ranger. I did some resource management as well. I was a fast typer, and I had an opportunity to transcribe some cultural history, some oral history from the Tlingit people across the way, whose homeland is glacier based. That was really a neat opportunity. The following season, I was a visitor use assistant, and I worked in the visitor information station doing camping permits and boating permits and dispatching on the radio for boats coming in and out of the park. And that program was within the law enforcement, the Visitor and Resource Protection Division. And so once a week or once a pay period, I would get a chance to go out. They'd let me do ride-alongs. In Glacier Bay, there's not a lot of proactive law enforcement. And I don't mean that to say that negatively. They do a lot of really good work, but a lot of what they do is visitor education because the boating regulations up there are pretty complex. And so they do a lot of education and a lot of verbal warnings and a lot of longer-term investigations. They're not necessarily dealing with DUIs and assaults every day, right? They're dealing with a different type of law enforcement. And I fell in love with what the law enforcement rangers were doing. I just really enjoyed it. And in my off season, while I was in college, I started getting interested in emergency response and emergency medicine. I took a a wilderness medicine course from Knowles. I don't know, sometime early in my college career. And I loved it. I thought that was super fun. And the rangers, they do all sorts of emergency response. That really interested me. So the Park Service, as you probably know at this point, has a Pathways program, which is an opportunity to hire students who have degrees that are similar to, the kind of support either land management or law enforcement and land management. And I was an environmental studies and politics major. I came home one summer and the chief ranger said, "Hey, we have this student hire program. Would you like a permanent job out of college? Are you interested in that?" And I was like, "Yeah, that sounds like a good idea."
Heck yeah.
I'm really grateful for that opportunity and for the folks who gave me that opportunity. I was the first local ever to become a law enforcement ranger there at Glacier Bay. They'd never been able to hire anybody locally before. And that was a really cool opportunity to bring my local experience and my experience of the park and the place into the National Park Service in that way. So within a couple of months of graduating college, I was in the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center and going through and becoming a federal law enforcement officer. And I spent 21 years with a commission, which was really an incredible career. I loved it.
Yeah. Do you have any experiences? Because it's like you said, it sounds like at different parks, there's unique things that law enforcement officers do, like even testing the air quality and stuff like that. Do you have, over your tenure, any unique experiences that stand out to you?
Yeah, we kind of joke. I'm good friends with somebody who does a lot of recruiting now for law enforcement in the National Park Service. And one of the things we kind of talk about is the uniqueness of each of the parks, right? That depending on where your interest lies, there's a park for you, right? If you want to be a river ranger and do a lot of cool archaeological monitoring and, be out in the park every day, right? There's Canyonlands. Or if you want to be front country, heavy duty law enforcement, lots of emergency response, you can go to the south rim of the Grand Canyon or Boulder Beach at Lake Mead National Recreation Area, right? There's different parks that offer you different opportunities in terms of skill set and training and experiences. So every park I've been to has something unique. I worked on the Blue Ridge Parkway for a while, and one of the big law enforcement issues they deal with, aside from traffic, they get a lot of motor vehicle accidents and things like that along the parkway because it's primarily a motorway, but they have plant poaching. They have people who come in and poach galax and ginseng plants from that area and sell them. It requires a lot of investigation because the person who's actually going out there and poaching the plant is generally somebody who's not paid very much and is just, getting paid for however many bundles they can get. And, that's just a job for them. But then they sell it and there's these rings of people who purchase those plants and, it's organized crime is what it is. And so there's some really interesting investigative work that gets done at parks, at both Smoky Mountains and the Blue Ridge Parkway, trying to figure out what's going on and shut down some of these rings that are encouraging the plant poaching. Fire Island National Seashore, we have endangered birds, these little piping plovers that match the sand almost exactly and are really hard to see. And there's certain times of year where the rangers spend a lot of time making sure that nobody's driving in those areas to protect these little birds while they're nesting. So, each park that you go to is unique and offers different opportunities and experiences. Here at these two parks at Arches and Canyonlands, we do, I mentioned water rescues. We do not only on boats to go out and save people who maybe get injured in the backcountry on the water, but we have folks who are Swiftwater certified who can jump into the water and swim and save somebody if they fall into the water. We have high angle certifications where, because we have so many cliff faces and a lot of climbing in both parks, we have folks who can, rig ropes and belay someone down to actually rescue somebody off of a rock face. So depending on the park, there's really unique opportunities. I have done four-wheel driving. At Lake Mead, when I worked there, we had off-road motorcycles because they were able to get us into places in the backcountry that we couldn't in our vehicles. And so I remember doing, backcountry patrols on a dirt bike, which was really unique. Some parks have horses. Some parks have different kinds of boats. In Florida parks, they have these airboats with these giant fans on the back that propel the boats.
Oh, yeah.
Here we have both propeller boats and jet boats that are just, different types of propulsion systems. So even among the boating in the National Park Service, there's a wide variety of what you might do or what skill you might need to get. So I think that's one of the things that kept me so engaged throughout my career was experiencing these different places and these different skills. And it allows you to kind of navigate according to what you want to do with your career and what interests you, which has been really fun.
So does search and rescue roll up into law enforcement?
Yeah, well, so our rangers are classified by their position description as 51% law enforcement minimum. So law enforcement is kind of their core duty, but many of those rangers have other skills. So depending on your park, you might do search and rescue. Most of our rangers are EMS certified. Many of them have like an EMT. Some of them have a park medic or a paramedic, a higher level of care. Some of our rangers are wildland fire certified. They have their red cards. Some of our rangers are structural fire certified. There's a few parks that have structural firefighting engines, and they do structural firefighting. I was a certified structural firefighter early in my career. So all of those emergencies.
What's a structural firefighter?
So a structural firefighter will go into a structure. A burning building is versus burning land.
Oh.
Yeah. So like a city, more like a city firefighter versus a wildland country firefighter. And those are two different skill sets. Even though there's fire, they're very different skill sets. You use different gear and different PPE and drive different types of vehicles. Those two are very different. So I really had a neat opportunity throughout my career to try different things and do different things and go into different areas and see different parks. It's been a really fabulous career thus far. I've really enjoyed it and I'm very grateful for it.
It sounds like you've had a lot of really cool, unique, different experiences. I guess how did you transition to becoming superintendent? I know there was a brief time where you were the chief of the Office of Public Trust. So I don't know if that kind of helped that superintendent transition.
Yeah, a little bit. So our law enforcement officers and our firefighters as well are all on what we call 6C retirement. They can retire within 20 years of doing emergency services because we recognize the physical and the emotional and mental toll that these jobs take on people, right? So because I started so early in my career, because I was 21 when I went through the academy, I always kind of knew that something was probably going to come next, right? I probably wasn't going to retire in my 40s. I was probably going to find something else. And so I always kind of had my eyes set on maybe a superintendency, maybe a regional job. I wasn't really sure. And, for a long time, it was really far off. And then all of a sudden it started getting closer, right? As things do. In the beginning of 2020, I had an opportunity to move to Washington and be the Deputy Chief of Operations and Policy. So we call it the DCOP. And that person is responsible for all law enforcement policy and for administering the law enforcement program across the National Park Service. And I really enjoyed that, but it was a really unique time to be in that position because it was right through the pandemic. And so I moved to Washington, D.C. and immediately got sent home to telework and teleworked for nearly 2 years while trying to provide leadership to this law enforcement program across 207 units that have law enforcement employees. So I really enjoyed it. But one of the things that also happened while I was in Washington is you get exposed to all of these different organizations and levels of government that opened a lot of doors for me. And so I had an opportunity a couple of years into my tenure there to sit on the law enforcement task force that the Secretary of Interior put together. She, in the wake of George Floyd and some of the protests that we'd had and kind of the public sentiment changing about law enforcement across the country, she commissioned a task force with representatives from each bureau with a law enforcement program. So there's 6 law enforcement programs in the Department of Interior to look at how we could strengthen public trust in our law enforcement programs and improve officer health and safety and make sure we had appropriate accountability for our law enforcement programs across the board. So that was a really unique opportunity to sit with my peers from other bureaus. So we had, Bureau of Indian Affairs and Bureau of Land Management and some Forest Service is not in DOI, but we interfaced with them as well. And then Bureau of Reclamation has an armed security force that was participating in that as well. So, there's really interesting opportunity to sit with all of those folks and learn about how we could better strengthen public trust in law enforcement because it really is it's a symbiotic relationship, right? We need to be trustworthy in order to have trust. And if we're trustworthy, people will trust us. And so strengthening public trust really is about being who we say we are and making sure that our officers are carrying that out in the field. And what became apparent to me, I will say more apparent to me, I'd always known this through the course of my career and in the regional office in particular. I learned a lot about public communication specific to law enforcement and how to be transparent and how to be more proactive in terms of law enforcement communication. If you in the 70s, 80s, 90s, if you saw a big incident happen in a city and you'd see video footage of the chief of police doing this for reporters saying, no comment, right? That was what we heard from law enforcement. It's super secret. We can't tell you anything, right? And for many years, that was okay with people and it's not anymore and probably shouldn't be, right? We, the people of America, give law enforcement their authority, and we have to be able to have trust in them. And in order to trust what our law enforcement officers are doing, who have this immense authority to take life and take liberty away from citizens, we need to make sure that we understand what they're doing and can be informed about, be informed voters and informed members of the democratic process. So all of that said, during some of this time where even before I was sitting on the task force, we started envisioning what an office might look like that would oversee body-worn cameras. So body-worn cameras, as you're probably aware, have become kind of the symbol of law enforcement transparency, right? Let's make sure we have this objective third party who records what happens on these contacts. But a body-worn camera doesn't increase transparency by itself. You have to do something with that video. You have to store it effectively in a secure location. You have to tag it so that it's retrievable again. You have to redact it appropriately in order to show it to somebody or share it with somebody or get, put it out in the media. And so when we started talking about how to oversee body-worn cameras as we were standing them up across the Park Service and the Park Police, we started also talking about an office that would be a broader and enable that sharing, right? Enable through the Freedom of Information Act, through congressional requests, through video redaction, through data management and storage, making sure that not only we were being able to be transparent with that information, but that information was safely, securely, and appropriately stored, and that the systems that operate in conjunction with the body-worn camera were operating appropriately and, maintaining all the security protocols for internet, IT security and everything. So I helped kind of envision this office. At the time, I didn't think I was still a law enforcement officer and this was going to be a non-law enforcement position. It never occurred to me that I might actually be the person in that position. But after sitting on the law enforcement task force and they asked me if I would be interested in acting in that position while they hired the position. And I just discovered I was fascinated not only with the purpose of this office, but also with the idea of standing up something new in the government. We don't get to do that very often, right? Stand up something from scratch. We were funded by Congress to do this thing. What does that look like? Who are we hiring? What do the PDs say? How do we train people, right? And so I was really intrigued by the opportunity to kind of be a part of that startup, and knowing at the time that just personally, but also professionally, that I wanted to get back out into the parks eventually, that was not going to be a forever job. I really wanted to kind of do that initial lift off the ground and then pass it along to somebody who was more interested in the long term. And from a personal life perspective, my husband and I wanted to move back west, and we always knew that was a goal. So long story short, when this job came open and the detail opportunity came up, I applied to the job and I was selected, and I got to come out here on detail and just have loved it. The rest is history, because there was no question in my mind once I got here that this is what I wanted to do. And so it's been really fun transitioning back into a park, being back on the ground, being back in uniform, being closer to the mission, right? The folks in the Washington office and the regional offices do incredible work, and their support of the parks is invaluable. Being here, doing the job again has been really, really meaningful and fulfilling for me.
Yeah. And it sounds like your soul is very fulfilled by spending time outdoors. And it sounds like even in this transition period, you've gotten the chance to have a lot of backcountry experiences and hikes. And, I can empathize with, I loved New York City, but it's hard to get secluded nature time
yes.
from the city. And DC is similar. Mm-hmm. There are opportunities, but it's not like going in your backyard and going on a hike.
Yeah. There's always other people on the trails.
That's cool that you were able to get.
Yeah.
One thing I'm curious about, kind of switching back to Arches and Canyonlands, can you share about the community artists in the parks program?
We have a unique program. Many parks bring in artists from other places to come to a park and live in the park and do art. We've chosen to collaborate with our local communities. And so we select somebody from the local community to partner with the park over the course of a year and do art and collaborate with the community and also with the park in that way. So it's really kind of a bridge between the park and the community in that way, because it is a local community member that we're engaging with, and who then in turn engages with the community. And in fact, some of the art that's on my wall that you probably can't see right now, but I actually have a piece of art on my wall that was left over from the last superintendent that I really love and enjoy. And so it's a neat opportunity for us to also see the park through a different lens, through working with these artists.
And is it one artist? It's like a yearly residency sort of thing?
That is my understanding. This is one of the things that I'm still getting up to speed on, but it is one local artist per year. They spend 7 months creating art and engaging visitors. I guess it started in 2009 in partnership with the Canyonlands Natural History Association. And they end up selling that artist's work in their stores after the 7 months is up. So you can go into the stores and see cards or prints from these artists as well.
And then another kind of program that I saw was, I guess it's not a program, but it's the Arches pilot reservation system. I was curious kind of how long that's been in play and what it means when it's a pilot. Is it just you're kind of testing it out and seeing if it will become a permanent requirement?
Yeah, I mean, for all intents and purposes, that's what we're doing, is testing it out and trying different things, trying different methods, and trying to make sure that whatever we land on in the long term is the right way of doing business. Over the last several years, visitation to Arches has increased dramatically, as it has in other Utah parks, right? So we're not the only park who's trying something like this out. I know Zion is also right in the midst of piloting and trying to plan for their visitor use. What we saw in Arches in particular was long lines at the entrance stations where people would have to wait and wait and wait. And sometimes people would purchase a pass. They'd get all the way to the front of the line. You'd get an entry to the park via your park pass, and then you'd go to one of your popular areas. You'd go to the Delicate Arch Trailhead, for example, and there wouldn't be any parking, and you'd have to wait and wait and wait again, right? So even people who were paying to access the park weren't getting a good experience. If you were on the trail, you would see lots of other people. We were starting to see resource damage because on any trail or area where you have too many people start walking off of trail to get away from the people or to go around the people, right? So we were starting to see resource damage. So we had a reduced visitor experience in terms of quality of visitor experience, resource damage, long wait times that sometimes would impact traffic out into the state roads because the line would get so long. So this is the third season in 2022. We did it because what is this for? In 2022, we did the first year of pilot. From 2022 to 2023, we gathered a lot of data and we adjusted things a little bit. We adjusted timing and the number of reservations and things like that. From 2023 to 24, we didn't have to make too many changes. We made some minor adjustments. And so this is the third year of piloting. Generally, what we've seen is rather than people, you mentioned coming to visit, kind of driving through the park pretty quickly on your road trip. The average visitor in Arches only spends 3 to 5 hours, right? So while we do have some people who spend longer, a lot of our visitors are day users, right? And so some parks can do a daily reservation. I think Glacier is doing a daily reservation. We do a timed reservation. So you get an hour block where you come in and enter the park, because we were seeing this huge bolus of people come through around 10 a.m., kind of mid to late morning. And again, kind of in the afternoon, we'd see these big groups of people that would come in and it would kind of, everything would get congested and these areas would get really busy. And so the pilot system that we've been using, this reservation system, spreads it out across the day. So you have the same number of people visiting the park, but when they visit, they know they can get in, they know there will be parking, they know their experience will be generally good because there'll be fewer people in whatever area they want to visit. We've identified carrying capacities kind of for each of these sites, where Delicate Arch, the Windows, Devil's Garden, these places that are highly visited, we're able to manage better and make sure that, parking and basic services, that there's enough restrooms for the number of people that are there and that sort of thing. So it's been really successful. Obviously, it's an additional administrative burden for folks who are coming to visit. But what we find is, a restaurant needs reservations, Disneyland needs reservations, right? When you go places, that's generally expected. And most visitors understand that. And most visitors want to be able to have a visit that they can plan for, and they know what to expect, and they know they can get into the park and have the experience that they want to experience. We really appreciate the local community that has done a great job of sharing the information, making sure that, people who are staying in the local hotels and renting cars and those types of things are aware of the requirement. It's still a learning process. We're still getting a lot of data and studying what it looks like and getting feedback from visitors and all of those things. But overall, we're having it's a much more positive experience that folks are having. We've gotten a lot of positive feedback. And generally, even people who don't have a reservation are able to get a reservation either that day or the following day. And because there's so many things to do in the Moab area, people will swap. They'll go to Canyonlands one day and Arches the next day, or they'll go down to the Needles instead, or they'll go back into Moab and do something else. So it's not like Arches is the only game in town. There's lots of things for people to do in the area.
Right. I talked about that with the Zion superintendent a little bit of, I think, just the way that the park is set up with it gets a bunch of congestion. I think a lot of parks are facing, congestion, and that's why there are so many different reservation systems and piloting different things. But we were talking about also kind of diversifying people's activities throughout the area to kind of spread out some of the activity. And so it's similar, like you're saying, of just being, maybe you go to Canyonlands one day and then go to Arches the next day when you do have the permit and stuff like that.
Exactly.
So that's cool. I know we're reaching the end of our time, and it's been a joy to hear about your experience growing up, your experience in law enforcement, and then dive into, I learned a ton about Canyonlands and Arches. I'd love to hear something I like to ask every superintendent is, what is something you wish everyone knew about Arches and Canyonlands National Parks, regardless of if they have or have not been?
Well, Arches, I think the best answer I can say for that is know that you need a reservation. It really, I want people to be able to come and have a good experience, right? And our goal with this reservation system is to make sure that they can have that they can have the experience that our visitors want. So plan ahead, make a reservation. That said, we release reservations the night before even, we release some more. So even if you're here and you want to go to Arches tomorrow, usually you can get in when you want to, but make sure you plan ahead. And along those lines, for all of our parks, we have a pretty extreme environment, whether it's class 5 rapids or 100+ degree heat or, lack of water in certain areas. And so planning ahead is so important for all of our parks. I wish that all people knew that. And many of our visitors do a great job of that. And we have a great search and rescue team for those that don't. But I'd rather visitors have a good experience than need to be rescued. I think Canyonlands in particular, I think so many people go to iSky and don't have the opportunity to see the other parts of the park that are less visited. And there's really just parts of that area that are amazing and gorgeous and really pretty accessible if you're willing to drive a little ways. And so I think what I would hope of visitors is that they make time to see some of the less visited areas of the parks, of all the parks. There's the really popular areas. And sometimes when you go to those ones that are less popular, I told you the story of hiking one trail versus the other just because I knew it was less popular. And sometimes those are some of the greatest experiences. And that also allows for more solitude and more of a wilderness experience in those areas as well. So I think that's something particular to Canyonlands, but really for all 4 of the parks, that there's really some unique opportunities to be had if you're willing to go off the beaten path a little bit, and don't literally go off the beaten path because some of our soil is alive and I don't want people to walk on it.
Yeah, no.
Not really. Stay on the path.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Well, thank you, Lena. It's been a joy and a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks for sharing your time.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for listening today. Who Runs This Park is presented by Expert Voice. Our music was composed by Danielle Bees. Don't forget to subscribe down below and tell your friends about it. This ensures that we can continue telling the stories of our national parks. Check out everything Who Runs This Park does at Linktree/Who Runs This Park. That's linktr.ee/Who Runs This Park. I'm Maddie Pellman, and you've been listening to Who Runs This Park.